Hello, and welcome to Online Education Across the Atlantic. And today we're going to have sort of a part two conversation. Our last episode, we talked about marketing and student recruitment for online higher education. And we sort of left with this question about the cost involved in this, because that drives a lot of the strategy of marketing for online higher education is the cost issue. And we talked about that in a perspective of AI and not truly rethinking how to do marketing and recruitment, and particularly with OPMs, there's a question about what are they truly doing new things, or are schools doing new things? Well, that leads to the question, let's talk about some of these costs that are involved and what that means. So that's what our episode is going to be about today, is a deeper conversation. Plus, we had a nice write-up where somebody had listened to that podcast and had some thoughts, so we want to address her post as well. But before we get to that, first of all, Morgan, welcome back from your big Scandinavian tour. I know you had quite a bit of travel involved, but it's good to see you. How was your trip?
My Scandinavian trip was awesome. A little too mobile, perhaps, but I was in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Got to hang out with Roger Larson, who has a long history in edtech. Founded Fronter, now founded Norvalid, and really interesting thinker about the edtech space. Got to hang out with him in Oslo, which is fast becoming one of my favorite places, and got to eat some amazing food, and mostly pastries and fish of various kinds, especially smoked salmon.
Have you done your typical, gone home and learned how to bake a specialized pastry or fish?
Yes, I'm working on Karelian pies from Finland, which are these little pies that have a rice filling, a rice porridge filling that you then chop with hard-boiled eggs that my spouse became enamored of. And so I was given notice to learn how to make them or else. I also, I don't drink alcohol, and I had some amazing non-alcoholic wine. Um, yeah, which shocked me. But one called Odd Bird, which is either from France or Italy, depending on which restaurant I was at, a sparkling wine. Another also sparkling white wine called Eins Zwei Zero.
I need to get some notes on this.
In honor of both of you, I had to try some non-alcoholic wine, and at least with red wine, I have to admit,
No, you got to stay
looks
away from
good.
the red.
If you want to cover yourself at a cocktail party, it looks like wine. That's the best I can say about it.
Yeah, you really need the acid to give it some body and some taste. So you really need white.
Well, it's great to see you as well, Neil. I are you now getting into family summer mode?
Yeah, I mean, my kids never seem to be at school at the moment, but we've had the one indicator that summer's arrived in the UK in that the first test match is starting. So, Morgan will appreciate this. England currently 302 for one against Zimbabwe, in the first test. So, that is a sign that the English summer's started, and on the sporting theme, I just have to say I'm a Spurs fan, and we won the Europa League trophy last night for any football fans or soccer fans out there.
Come on, you
So yeah,
Spurs.
come on, you Spurs, absolutely. So Spurs are doing well, England are doing well, the sun's shining until Bank Holiday weekend coming up. So yeah, it,
And
it
I,
is. Yeah, it's getting there.
I feel this podcast is getting away from me with the non-alcoholic drinking and the cricket and the proper football. But I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to learn. So before we get to our main topics, the thing as I was browsing this morning, the big news is National Student Clearinghouse in the U.S. just came out with their updated enrollment numbers for higher education. And for spring of 2025, the enrollment has gone up 3.2%. Some areas, like primarily online institutions, are higher, like 3.9%. I think graduate enrollment has gone up this time, but only 1.5%. But the general message or the general thing is we've now had, is it 3 or 4 semesters in a row of enrollment growth that we're seeing in the US. Um, but at the same time, I think most schools at this point are acknowledging the fact this is coming into the entry into the demographic cliff. Like we're projected to hit peak 18-year-olds in early 2026, and then there's a long-term decline. So it's great to see enrollment increases and for multiple terms in a row. But at the same time, that doesn't mean schools are saying, this is fixing our finances. It's just, okay, at least this issue is not as bad as it used to be. So that's probably the main thing I'm seeing over here, other than the ongoing reconciliation bill, which could be leading to risk sharing, a new concept, which, by the way, I'm going to start covering in a lot more detail, including data analysis. But Neil, anything happening on your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main bits of news are around government policy and around the continuing announcements of universities cutting jobs. So one of the big things that came up recently was around international education policy. So the government proposed a cut to the graduate route, which is essentially how long international students can stay in the UK. So they proposed that would come down from 2 years to 18 months. They also interestingly suggested that they'd kind of take a 6% cut of international student fees, which I think was a bit of a curveball from them. So that was interesting. So neither of those are particularly good pieces of news for the sector. So the general theme over here is still tales of woe from different sources, essentially.
Well, I wouldn't term ours as not having tales of woe. It's just, at least on the term to term enrollment, that's actually been one piece of positive news. So I wouldn't overinterpret good things happening over here.
Yeah, well, look, our tale of woe is that we don't have that data recent enough to be able to tell us that.
Yeah, data is good.
Phil talking about data reminds me that he was insulted in a lawsuit this week as a purported expert.
That's right. That's my new title.
The purported expert.
Yes. Yeah, basically, it surprised a lot of people. The U.S. Department of Education is fighting back on the lawsuit against gainful employment and financial value transparency, which was the version 3 was created by the Biden administration. The Trump administration is fighting to keep it pretty strong. I have actually done data analysis, so I've been part of the lawsuit. And as Morgan said, they deliberately insulted me, called me the purported expert. I'm just trying to drive them into a battle of experts. And yes, I mean, you do know I enjoyed being insulted that way. So
yeah, I've heard you called a lot worse than that, to be honest, Phil. But I don't think you could mention that on the podcast.
And that's just by me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they didn't go far enough. All right, so let's get to our topic about the marketing. But in one way to look at this, I want to do a segue. So there was a nice post by Andrea McConaughey. That's my attempt. I will find out if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly with feedback. She is Executive Vice President of Marketing at All Campus. And let me just read her intro because it gives a nice summary of the episode we just did. And then we can mention, some of her points. So she wrote, recently I had the opportunity to tune into an episode of Online Education Across the Atlantic in which Phil Hill and his colleagues Glenda Morgan and Neil Mosley discussed the marketing challenges that OPMs and their university partners face. And just to clarify, we did talk on even the non-OPM side. It's a valuable conversation, one I encourage anyone in or adjacent to higher education to listen to. The episode raised important questions about the sustainability of the current digital marketing playbook, whether OPMs are innovating quickly enough, especially in the age of AI, and what taking marketing in-house instead of partnering with an OPM really means. As someone who leads a team responsible for driving enrollment growth and marketing online programs across dozens of university partners, I wanted to offer a perspective from inside the OPM world, an inside look at how we actually operate, what we prioritize, and how we're evolving. So for me, actually, I like that. That did captured the gist of our episode accurately. And I'll just point out a couple of her main points, but then get your thoughts on it. Her headings, it's not just about speed, it's about precision. And she recognized, she said Phil was right in saying that OPMs are built for speed. But then she talks about precision. On AI and innovation, it's evolution and not hype. I'll get your view on if she really addressed that. The myth of the static playbook. I think that's, I read that as a shot across Morgan's bow. She's the one who brought that up in the previous episode. And what in-house really means, and talking about spend, which we're going to covering, and marketing is not a silo. So first of all, I really appreciate her listening carefully to the episode and it leading to somebody adding thoughts from this perspective. But I wanted to check with you. Any points you guys have or things you noticed from her article?
I think one general point to make is that when we're sort of discussing this, we are talking generally across a whole range of different companies. And so, and obviously I'm focused on the UK side of things. So I definitely would say that there is some evidence that I've seen that there is a bit of a static playbook. I can't say that across the board, and I know that they're I'm not saying that companies aren't evolving and aren't looking to change some things, but I think that's an important point to make, that there's some generalization across a range of different companies, and some companies are kind of pushing further than others. Some for reasons such as kind of company upheaval means that they're not necessarily as dynamic in this area as they might be. So there will always be there'll always be people at different stages, but I think that's what I'd say. I mean, it's a reflection of some examples. It's not a reflection of the whole.
Every example.
Every example. I think that's what kind of the article made me think.
And I had to reflect on this in some detail recently at ASU GSV, where I had recently written that post about the problems with efficacy research. And I upset a lot of people. And I like to think that means I'm saying something worthwhile, but I had to sort of walk around and say, I didn't mean you. I didn't mean you. What's true of the general is not true of every particular case.
In a way, it's like it's a sort of an interesting conversation, but there's an element of we're talking about the sector at large, and we're actually talking across two countries, and also I thought the article was really useful and really good. But also, if you're representing a company, then you obviously want to present your company in a good light. And I'm not saying that anything that was said was amplified or anything, but obviously, we all have different things that we bring into the debate and discussion around this kind of thing. So
I didn't take her comments as a critique of our podcast. I took it as, okay, this was a valuable conversation. Now let me give you my view from one company from the inside to add to the conversation. So, I mean, I don't think she would disagree with us on this as well. And she deliberately was giving her perspective. I will pick up on this question, though. When she talked about the myth of the static playbook, I don't think she fully captured the point, because I think what we're talking about was structurally, like, how can you do marketing and spending in this area in a different way? Particularly generative AI is significantly different. Does that change targeting? Does that change your operations? That was the point, was a structural. What she said was essentially pointing out an iterative learn quickly and adjust type of mode. She talked about, we've seen programs where our initial strategy and tactics didn't deliver, and in those cases we pivot quickly. We try different things. So she's talking more tactical feedback loop, learning and adjusting, which is great. Our point Morgan's point, was much more on the structural playbook level. And so I still think that's something that needs a lot more discussion, but I really appreciate her inside view. I will point out one other thing, then we'll get into our main topic. She had a section called Let's Talk About Spend. And she said there's a tendency to focus solely on media dollars. How much goes to paid ad on Google and LinkedIn, for example. But what's often overlooked is the time and expertise that goes into performance. For example, SEO, search engine optimization, is one of our most powerful tools, but it requires a lot of collaboration to make that work. And then she points out it's not cash out the door, but it's a significant investment in talent and time. So I think that's a really good point she's making and adds some context to what we're about to talk about. So thank you very much. We encourage more follow-up discussion and alternate points of view. So let's talk a little bit more about what this spending issue really looks like and what are the issues. And let's start out from a U.S. perspective, partially because I think we tend to spend more in this area. So Morgan, tell us a little bit about marketing for online programs and what you've seen.
So, part of my interest in this issue comes because it's the big online programs that suck up all the media coverage. So you hear a lot about Southern New Hampshire and Maryland Global College and Purdue and so on spending 100-odd million per year. I think I forget the exact number of Southern New Hampshire, but last year they spent 180 or something like that million, of which 69 million was Google spend. But they suck up all the headlines and the discussion, and people talk as though they are the average, and they're not the average. They're the far, far, far outlier. And so part of why I got interested in the topic was because I want to find out what the more general, typical state of play is, and we shouldn't be focusing on these kinds of things. It's like talking about company income and comparing Phil Hill and Associates with Google or Apple or something like that. It's a very different thing. So I've been trying to dig into things, and part of the problem is that we don't have great data. And so I've been both looking at reports from places like Ruffalo Noel Levitz and Simpson Scarborough and OHO and places like that, and then looking also at individual reports from institutions, especially when they try and propose something, and that's proposed rather than actual spend. But we're still sort of looking at at least a vastly different world, and but there's real problems with getting the data and with coming up with some really good numbers. And I can talk more about what they actually start to look like, but I'll stop there.
No, don't stop there, because I think it'd be a good marker. Well, first of all, I do want to ask the question. The ones you hear about, the Southern New Hampshires, the very large online. So one way I would categorize this, but I want to see if I'm thinking about it right. It's not just that they're large and therefore if you multiply with huge number of students, it's more of an institution whose goal is to almost unlimited scale. That might be too strong, but the point is we want to scale. We want to continue growing. Whereas there's a lot of online programs that are more like, well, as long as we get to this level and it's self-sustaining, we're not trying to grow beyond that, or it's very limited growth. So it's sort of the goals of the institution, not just the size. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one interesting way of looking at it, and I can't do this now, but I'll do it maybe when I write about it, is look at a sort of spending per student, because that is one way where it would come out. But another way is even some of the well-established, what we think of as being fairly large programs have different goals. So you've got a Southern New Hampshire, and then you've got a Penn State World Campus. And I was at Penn State in 2014 talking with them about this, and at that point they had a goal to substantially grow. I think they were aiming at 20,000 students. Some years later, they really pulled that back, and they've got an upper limit of, I think, around 15,000, where they don't want to go above that. So even though they're a large, well-established program, they want to keep it smaller. So there's a big difference there. I must also apologize to Southern New Hampshire, because part of the reason why we pick on them is because they are actually very transparent in their spending. And they put it in their 1099, whereas many places bury it in all different kinds of places. So we know what their spending is because they're just very transparent about it.
All right, so before we hand it over to Neil, put a stake in the ground. What are the rough ranges on the metric you mentioned, marketing spend per student, just to give a sense?
So Ruffalo Knoll Levitz has an average from last year of about just under $1 million for an institution spending on online. And so that's also a complication of the data. Is like some data comes from central marketing, some is specifically online. So you've got a confusion there. So, just say, it would be about $100 per student, if you take the entire student body, or maybe a larger amount if you just look at online. But that's roughly the average, is about $1 million for.
What about, and I want to focus more on online, because I've seen an online in the US, particularly OPM, that quite often you're talking about $1,000 to $3,000 per student in marketing and recruitment spend.
I would say it's higher than that, because that's also almost the Coursera amount, which is around about $1,500. I would say it would actually be about $15,000.
I saw some numbers with 2U getting up into the
Yeah,
$15,000 range, but my personal feeling is that's an outlier, and it was based on particularly when pre-edX, when they were
yeah,
going for a small number of students at elite programs. So that does give a book into it,
yeah,
$1,500 to $15,000 per
yeah,
student for fully
yeah.
online.
And the problem is I at the moment I'm not in a headspace where I can really abstract away, because I've got too many examples in my head.
Well, we'll
So
talk about,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
I know of one program where they spent $300,000 to recruit 8 students.
well, yeah, but that's called a fail. That's called a failure. So. All right, so Neil, let's jump over to the UK in particular. What have you seen in this topic, particularly around marketing for online programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, similar to what Morgan's saying, it's really hard due to the absence of any transparent data reporting to know the marketing spend specific to online, and the kind of benchmarks that I tend to have are through conversations you have around OPM companies, and certainly, the range that you're talking about of kind of over £1,000 as it is in the UK for kind of cost of acquisition for students definitely chimes with me. Obviously, it kind of varies from company to company, but I mean, there's so many different costs depend relative to where an institution is, really fundamentally. I mean, I guess we're talking about the spend. If we
The sort of
kind of
steady
pick,
state.
yeah, we're talking about the steady state, and so my this may just be a quirk of some of the clients that I work with, but there's even some of those universities I know that are a bit more mature on this. There's still so much more distance to travel relative to a really strong, mature OPM model across a whole range of different things. There's just the fact that you know online marketing has to be more sustained. It's less of a fixed cycle, and I think one of the things we talked about in terms of the LinkedIn response is that I think one thing that shouldn't get missed is the kind of people resource, the increase in kind of capacity to do a lot of these things, to kind of set up a nurture sequence, to optimize your CRM, to produce, even if it's kind of AI generated, produce great content. All of these different things I think involve an increase in kind of people resource, an increase in kind of marketing tech, as well as all of the budgets that we're talking around the channel and the paid side of stuff in terms of social and search. And then you have all the affiliate listing sites, and then you've got to monitor the quality of those, how well they're performing. Are they generating enough leads? Are they generating high quality leads? So you've just got a whole bunch of considerations that involve more work and more regular expenditure. And I think, in general in the UK, I can't think of many universities sort of crack that and are just optimizing across those activities.
So on that subject on the lead, it reminded me of I'll do this. It's anonymous. I mean, we know who it is, but we got a really good feedback from the previous episode in a private email. Not sharing the person, but somebody who knows the inside of the market very well. And one of the points was, I am constantly amazed by the fact that measurement systems and appropriate tracking of the correct metrics is missing. And the conversation there is about OPM companies. So companies where this is their specialty. So the criticism is those people. So we're not even talking about universities who don't even think about this in a professional sense, but OPMs, the correct metrics is missing. Probably worth a deeper conversation, but the areas center on cohort-based lead to enrollment tracking by channel type. So brand versus keyword social, and that's inadequate and poorly attempted attribution modeling. So basically, how do you track TV advertising? Does that translate over to digital and then social media? And the first touch and last touch. So we're not experts in marketing on this podcast. I certainly am not, but it raises questions. So the argument there is even inside the specialist companies who do this, they haven't fully figured out how to do all of this attribution. And I think that point about TV to digital to social is huge because when you talk just a regular university not using an OPM, how much of their marketing really is based on the brand of that university that happens from not just TV, football games in the US, but that general brand, and how do you attribute that down to students caring about that university, then wanting an online program, and then the social, and then closing the deal. So it was an interesting point talking about that. There's still a lot to learn, even within the companies who specialize in this area, particularly around tracing it. So that's part of the reason I think it's also difficult to say what is the spend. I think they try to hide a lot of marketing, but I think it's hard to answer the question too.
Yeah, I think I'd add on that, sorry to just put in, Morgan, that I've definitely seen examples of universities over here or OPMs working with universities where it feels like because the level of budgets that they have, they're everywhere, particularly for periods of time. And it's interesting when you kind of have conversations with universities who are, weighing up that array of channels that the university for an OPM partnership are on and what they think about the performance of those channels. And that makes me think sometimes that the scope of the budget and the possibilities to be across and visible across all of these channels can sometimes perhaps mean that there's less of a focus on like how well are all these performing, whereas a university has a smaller budget, they have to be a bit more focused on that. So that's one thing that I've witnessed here.
In general, I would say measuring return on investment is a very weak part of the marketing place, and it's acknowledged as much, I would say, by marketing professionals in the online space especially. And part of what they're also dealing with is that what they understand, even if what they understand to be important is not what the leadership of the institution finds to be important. So they find themselves having to repeat bad metrics because that's what the leadership wants, like clicks,
Yeah, and things like number of leads generated. I mean, that's a really interesting area. You can have a huge amount of leads, but how good are those leads? How what's the quality of those leads as well? And so yeah, that's where you can get in that the metric kind of drives the activity a little bit.
One thing that's interesting, we're talking about the missing data. That's true even with publicly traded companies. So when 2U was, public and you would look at their data, it was pretty difficult to be able to sort through their reporting and come down to an accurate answer of, well, how much do they spend marketing per student? Because I think that's the most natural metric that people want to be able to think about is spending per student.
The cost of
Because
acquisition. Yeah.
yeah, but then all right, so that gets into the cost of acquisition, CAC, outside of higher education. That is the primary metric to track this type of issue. How much are we spending to acquire a new customer? Well, it's complicated here because for an OPM, who's your customer? Is it this new student in a program, or is your customer the picking up a university as a partner? So definition of customer is tricky. But my point is, therefore, even with publicly traded companies, it's hard to go down and attribute a number. And then to keep picking on 2U, they own edX. So even when you do get the numbers, and Coursera, they have degree programs and they have free programs and they have paid programs. Well, how do you attribute this spending for MOOCs versus a master's degree program? Because those are fundamentally different, but you can't get separate reporting. Um, so that's true. And then, Morgan, you mentioned the Form 990s in the US that tracks nonprofits and universities. Then it's just a complete mess outside of maybe Southern New Hampshire trying to get information. So I definitely, yeah, it's definitely tricky. All right, but let me pick up on one thing. And it's not just that I know I keep going to the abstract, what's the summary, but Morgan, you mentioned it. The across an entire university, you're talking hundreds of dollars on marketing across per student across all students. Let's just take that as an assumption. Online programs were both UK and US talking about $1,000 or more. So you're talking about at least an order of magnitude. So online programs, it tends, at least where it looks like you're talking a fundamentally different marketing spend per student. Is that accurate? Why is that the case? Should that be the case?
I think it's accurate, and probably even more accurate than we think, because I was pulling that data from a Ruffalo Noel Levitt's report, which I think is based on a survey, and they did a great job as far as they could, but it's a small survey, and the survey is biased in favor of smaller institutions with centralized marketing. So I think it's even more advanced as an order of magnitude. Sorry, what was the original question?
Well, part of it is that accurate, but then getting into a why is it and should it be that way? What are your thoughts, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak at this in terms of the UK. I mean, one of the reasons why I think is the different demographic of learners. I mean, look, if you juxtapose, your typical undergraduate student, your typical online student, they're different in age and stage, and that has an influence on marketing, because generally if you're a younger adult having come through school, you're on a set pathway, you're already doing research, you're going through a central admissions service, and therefore that journey from an interest in further study at a university into application, and the way in which you might grab the attention of that person for your university is kind of fundamentally different from me as an adult thinking, what, I want to do an engineering management master's, say, just pluck that out of the air. Okay, I've got to do my own research around what universities offer that. And I'm doing it in February because it came up in February. And so that's one of the fundamental differences, is that I'm not a student that's going through school that the teacher's telling me, oh, are you going to apply for UCAS? You've got five or six choices. You're having to grab people who are just thinking about this at different stages, that don't have in the UK a centralized area. So I think that's one of the big fundamental differences for online, and obviously demographics may change, but I think that's one of the reasons why the tactics are different and the spend are different, because you chat to some universities over here and they say, oh, well, we're going to a UCAS roadshow, or, there's kind of easier ways, and maybe I'm doing them a disservice here, but there's slightly easier ways for them to reach a prospective undergraduate degree audience that are going to come on campus than there are on this kind of mass audience that could be anywhere, thinking about it any time for
And,
online
and
degrees.
and partly, I recently did a thing where I spoke to lots of online leaders of education, and one of them explained it very concisely to me, which is that marketing is different for an on-campus program than it is for an online program, because the order of preferences is different. So with a typical on-campus undergraduate program, particularly, brand is important. The brand of the institution, its institution brand, and then college sometimes, particularly if you're in a professional program, and then program. It's reversed actually with online. Program is much more important than college and then institution. So you can't coast off that brand, which you would typically do for an on-campus program. So you've got to really do different things.
I would add to this sort of our first episode, talking about speed. Everything with online is about speed. And Neil, you were mentioning it's fundamentally different, an adult in
Mm-hmm.
February looking at a program. There's also the element that traditional marketing, you might take days or weeks to respond to somebody who's
Months.
interested.
Yep.
Months, yeah, exactly. But they're not going to school until September. So that's part of the process. You accept it, and that happens. Whereas in online, well, if you're not going to respond to them, somebody else is. And so there's a competitive nature that's introduced much more in online education that's based on speed, is that you need to be able to respond to students who are asking for, or prospective students who are asking for information. So that gets to that whole speed issue that, and even Andrea was talking about.
And
And
the
that
data
drives up
shows
cost.
And the data shows that students online expect speed, and they will respond, and they will end up enrolling with the first person that responds to them in general.
Yeah, and I think just to add a bit more flavour to that, I mean, in the UK, there's definitely been, and I had a conversation the other day about this. There's definitely been instances where actually, where a partnership falls down is actually where the university is playing a role in that speed, but not working quickly enough with the leads that the OPM is generating. And that it tends to be, the narrative tends to be, when things go wrong, the OPMs are the bad guys, the universities are the good guys. But there are a number of instances where the universities haven't been able to operate at a speed which fundamentally hampers that relationship working well. And if I can just go on one other thing, I think the other thing in relative to the spend is also where a university is in terms of the online market. For some, they have no presence in the market at all. And so there's that sense in which there's that need to invest, not just to recruit the students, but also to kind of develop a presence in the market as well. And I think that has an influence on the level of investment at what stage too.
So let's pick up on this because I think we're talking around a common theme. Traditional university and college marketing, we think of it in terms of hundreds, low hundreds of dollars on spend per student. We think of it in terms of weeks and months responding. We think of it in terms of brand awareness. So it's just so fundamentally different. So on the online programs, you're up at least an order of magnitude in cost, up into the thousands of dollars or pounds per student. You're talking about minutes and hours response. You're talking about changing the priority of what you look. I think this tension that we described this in the last episode, it's unfortunate that it's called the same thing, marketing, because I think that leads a lot of universities to think, oh, so now we've added some modality, we need to do some specialized marketing here, without recognizing, no, this is just a fundamentally different practice once you get into fully online programs. And that's a huge source of tension.
And that's sort of part of my frustration with trying to learn about the space, because some of my data source is about marketing in general, so like the Simpson Scarborough chief marketing officer surveys, which show that there's very little spend on technology, especially outside of large institutions, and they're not investing in data and things like that. I wonder how much that is true about online marketing, which lives often in a different place. Um,
Well, let me jump in there. CRM. Right there. You can get by with traditional marketing to have an inefficient or even a non existent CRM in marketing. And online programs, you need to have the technology infrastructure to be able to respond. And quite often, CRM is one of the key components. Well, there, for a typical university, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to get one in and get it set up the right way. So I'm going back to Andrea's point. It's not just media spend with
yeah.
Google and Facebook and LinkedIn. It's also infrastructure spend. And then you mentioned, Neil, and also presence in the market. And so there's a lot of, let's just call that broadly, infrastructure spend to be able to get into the game
Or
in
brand
addition to
versus
that.
performance marketing, sort of, yeah, so big picture versus more tactical.
Yeah, and I think it's priorities as well. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think in this discussion, if we're talking about hypothetically universities and then what they'd need to kind of invest in, it certainly would be roles as well. And we've had a bit of a debate over here with things coming up around, an increase in professional services staff and kind of the questioning of any other roles that aren't academic. And that's slightly where my mind goes with some of this, because if you're saying you need to spend more money but you also need to recruit more people in that in that kind of bucket of staff categories, and
And
that
often they're going to be expensive.
exactly. And so how does that play out with the, that kind of constant debate that's running along of like, oh, especially at the moment with finance, oh, look at how many more professional services staff this university's recruited over the last 5 years. And it's like, guys, this,
Administrative bloat.
yeah. And, that's quite simple bandwagon to jump on, without a lot of nuance.
Well,
The
let's
other
take,
one,
go
one,
ahead,
one,
Morgan.
one thing I want to also like, not only is spending in different buckets and it's hard to capture it. So I've been looking at actual university budgets for online programs and where online marketing spending shows up in different buckets, so it's hard to get an overall picture. But not only that, but I saw in one of the surveys I read that 20% of schools said that marketing happens outside of the central unit. I think that's a central marketing perspective. I recently, as I said, for a client, did a bunch of research, spoke to a lot of online learning leads around the country, and all but one said that marketing happens in the individual departments. Literally. So it was like 1% said marketing happens in the individual departments. And it's also one of the things that drives up spend, because they land up bidding against themselves in some of that purchasing. When they're buying keywords for Google, they're bidding against their own people, so it actually drives up spend. But it's happening all over the place. In 99% of the institutions, online marketing happens within the online unit and in the departments that are running online programs.
Okay, in our remaining time, let's be judgmental. And I'll take, let's take the, no, let's take the, we're having a lot of debates here in the US about student debt and the cost and where federal financial aid comes from. All right, so let me take that point of view. Why should the government be spending this much money on marketing? Why are you're telling me I'm giving out loans, which effectively end up subsidizing the schools through, why should we keep spending more and more money that goes into marketing that and online education? So I understand why we're spending more, but is that a good thing? Are
I,
there
I want I want
limits
to
to it?
I want to channel my inner John Katzman here. Um, why are we spending taxpayer money to subsidize Google and
Yeah.
Facebook?
Why are we subsidizing Google and Facebook? Why, but also why are we we just talked about all these professional staff. Why are we paying for more and more marketing? That's not instruction. So there is a legitimate question here about the public good side. So in particular for publicly funded universities, but in the U.S. because of federal financial aid, that essentially becomes everybody. Um, is that a good thing? Like, where are the limits?
I don't think it's a good thing, but I think there are some changes afoot that may actually bring it back, at least reduce it a little bit, if not bring it back into a reasonable one. One is, buried in the tech news recently was the fact that Google search is going down. I think driven by you and your wife, Phil.
Yep.
Um,
ChatGPT is the way to
yeah,
do search.
so that will also take some pressure off some of those Google AdWords and sort of things like that. I think AI will eventually play a role in helping some of these processes be more efficient and things like that. So I think there are some things that will spin that spending down, but we've got to get out of that, even though, as Andrea McConaughey said, not all marketing spend is paid media spend, but a substantial part is. So going back to our favorite poster child, Southern New Hampshire, more than a third of their marketing spend is paid media spend just on Google, just on one source. And so it's substantial. So we've got to sort of figure out a way to sort of do some of that and make it better. But I'm not sure that we have a solution yet.
Yeah, I would make 2 points. I'm not so hopeful that AI will necessarily reduce costs because I think ultimately those costs might just be felt in a different way somewhere else. To gain the visibility that essentially you're trying to gain via Google, whether that's content marketing that gets you on the search results or gets you on there. So I'm less hopeful on that front. But I also think, look, if governments saying, well, look, should our funding be spent on this, then I think they have to do more than just say something. I mean, they have to kind of intervene in some way to make it less. I don't know. I think you can't just say, oh, well, look, this is not good that it's spent in this way, because it's spent in that way to gain visibility and to gain enrollments. And there might be other ways to reduce costs, but it's an effective way to do that for the programs that you're offering. So, it's fine to say, look, this is a problem, but that doesn't go far enough for me. And I'm not advocating for more government interventionism in this kind of thing, but that has to go hand in hand with something that actually affects a change rather than just saying, oh, we're not happy with this.
I think for me the fundamental problem goes back into the comparison with traditional marketing. Because I'll add another one. Part of what you're paying for is expanded access. If you don't reach students, we're creating a way for non-traditional students and working adults to do lifelong learning, expand access to higher education beyond the traditional 18 to 24. So in my mind, part of what you're paying for is expanded access, and we need to think of it in investment terms, as opposed to, hey, we're shifting to online and it's costing more and we're lining people's pockets.
I think you're right, Phil, but I want to posit a counterexample that I think the truth lies in between us. 1 in 10 people in the United States who have a master's degree in computer science have a degree from Georgia Tech. They do not spend any money on marketing.
Yeah, well, but all right, so that gets to my second point. What we don't want to do is you can't compare it directly to regular
No,
marketing
you
spend.
can't.
That's the fundamental
We
mistake,
agree
because
on
then
that.
you start making bad moral judgments and you miss the point, you miss the fact that this is what it takes. So don't do that. However, now you take it as a new discipline of marketing and recruitment for online programs. I do think there needs to be some structural improvements. I'm more optimistic. Neil brought us down on AI, but I'm more optimistic that there are some opportunities to fundamentally change things there. Um, and I'm not saying it will automatically happen, but we need to have limits on the spend on marketing. And it is a problem that the AdWords auction markets for Google, Facebook, LinkedIn keep going up, that schools or departments are competing with each other. I think there's a bad side, but don't compare it to traditional. Look at it
Yeah.
as its own discipline and saying, here's what we're paying for, and here's where we need improvements, and here are limits when it comes to public
I heard
policy.
a story once years ago, which is probably apocryphal, but when they created none of it, they had to come up with a name in Canada for the rest of it. And so they held a poll, and the two top entries were the rest of it and Fred. So I think we should call this new discipline Fred.
Fred, that's right. Fred marketing. That's our new campaign.
Fred, yeah. How much do you spend on Fred?
Yeah. Hey, well, this has been great. I've enjoyed. I don't know how it is for listeners or viewers, but I've enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's exposing a lot of the topics that get covered. But once you focus on the marketing side, it gets it out in public. Who knows? We might have a third episode on this topic that we need to follow up on. So thanks. It's great seeing you all, and look forward to seeing you in just less than 2 months in person in Leeds. And thank you for all of our viewers and listeners.